Does the US remain committed to the collective defense of Europe and the common security of the West?
Very much so, and I don't think that's come under any serious question by President Trump. I mean, remember that this is his negotiating style. He will push the envelope as far as he can to try to pressure the other side to meet his demands as much as possible, and much of the demands come in very exaggerated form. I don't even know if the 5% will be met within 10 years, just the way the 2% was not met by one-third of the NATO countries after the 2014 commitment at the Wales Summit. But the idea that NATO countries together will be collectively spending another $1 trillion or so to beef up European security defense makes sense for Europe, it makes sense for the United States, and it makes sense for the entire NATO alliance, especially to send very strong signals to Russia, to Iran, or to any other countries that might be threatening the European continent, that Europe is serious about its own self-defense and not simply waiting for Washington to come to its defense anytime there's a crisis.
Regarding the Middle East and the Iran-Israel conflict, is the ceasefire realistic and viable, or will there be reignition in the area?
I believe every rational person in the world hopes and prays that it will be an enduring ceasefire, but that depends on the parties. There's no way to predict by anyone whether or not this will hold. I believe the major concern right now is the Iranian response. I think that they feel very vulnerable now that they have lost their air defenses, at least in central and western Iran, against the Israeli Defense Force that was able to operate with near impunity in the skies over central and western Iran and over most of the city of Tehran. And obviously the United States, with its advanced stealth bomber technology, was able to penetrate any Iranian air defenses and deliver the payload that it did in Operation Midnight Hammer last weekend. The question is going to be, what does Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei feel he needs to save face with the hardliners inside of the Iranian government, and especially the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, that is the paramilitary force inside of Iran that has an enormous hold over the Iranian economy, that has established proxy forces in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, and the extent to which they understand now that it's a very different, weakened, and exposed Iran going forward, or whether they operate under the delusion that they can continue to be the leading international sponsor of terrorism around the world, to continue to destabilize, undermine, and seek to overthrow the governments of neighboring Gulf Sunni Arab countries, to annihilate the state of Israel, which is essentially a one-bomb country, and to continue to threaten and to attack European and American targets on European and American soil. So the decision is really up to the Iranian leadership, and we hope they have come to their senses after these unfortunate but necessary developments of recent weeks, and that they will begin to act more like a normal neighbor in the Middle East and help bring about broader stability, prosperity, and peace for all the countries and all the peoples of the Middle East.
Is this possible without regime change? It seems that Israel's security concerns have not been met, although Israelis are waging war for 2 years now in 5 or 6 fronts, rather successfully.
It may be difficult to imagine that there's going to be regime behavior change without regime change. Again, this is a very radical, ideological theocracy in Tehran that has been waging war against its neighbors and against the West for 46 years, ever since they came to power in Iran in 1979. It's very difficult to imagine them changing their behavior in any serious way without provoking essentially a civil war inside of Iran between those hardliners that want to take a more aggressive approach and those that are more realistic about the future prospects of Iranian aggression, given that its nuclear weapons program has been rendered inoperable for months, if not for years, that its ballistic missile program has been defanged with the destruction of so many of its missile launchers by the Israeli Defense Forces, and that they realize that countries like China and Russia and North Korea have not really come to the aid of Iran in any meaningful or substantive way. They're very much alone now in that part of the world, and the question, again, will take some time. It's very, very quick right now. It's too quick and too short a period after the very effective, devastating blows by the American Air Force to determine whether or not this will be a long-term course. We hope that will be the case, but in the end, if there is regime change, that will have to come from the Iranian people themselves. There is no appetite in Washington, D.C. to provoke any type of a war that requires American soldiers to go to Iran and to promote either regime change or nation building. No sane person in the United States wants to see the American military do anything like that. So if it takes place, it will have to be at the initiative of the Iranian people themselves.
What about the role of Turkey in the region? There's an ongoing concern. I see more and more articles in the American press and the think tanks that Turkey is not anymore a reliable ally for NATO and the US.
The Turkey question remains a very, very difficult and complex one in Washington, D.C. Clearly, President Erdogan's foreign policy drift away from the United States, away from NATO, towards greater independence, whether it's in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether it's in establishing a network of like-minded countries in Central Asia, whether it's forging closer ties with the Communist Party of China, and whether it's becoming a more assertive military actor, not only in the Middle East, through the power vacuum that it's trying to fill in Syria, but also the fact that it established bases in Qatar, in Somalia. It's now an active player in the Libyan civil war, and it continues to promote arms sales throughout the African continent. So, Turkey has inserted itself very, very energetically and aggressively in so many of the conflicts and crises in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa, and it will likely continue to seek a very, very important role. Remember, it sees itself under President Erdogan as a neo-Ottoman quasi-imperial power whose influence should extend far beyond its current borders. We'll see how this plays out in terms of the desire of the new Syrian government to lessen Turkey's influence in the new government there, to what extent Turkey's rejection of Israel's position in the Middle East will harm its current stature in Washington, where there is a very strong pro-Israel sentiment, and where its continued aggression against countries, obviously, such as Greece and Cyprus, continue to sour the taste in the European Union for Turkey's activities. At the same time, however, the fact that Europe is now looking to build up its defenses in a more sort of a strategic depth type manner means that many European countries will look to Turkey's massive military, right? The second largest military in NATO after the United States, to help to beef up NATO's non-U.S. numbers. So I think much of this also depends on the posture that Europe takes towards Turkey. Will they be serious about the values that they pronounce when it comes to Ukraine and the right of Ukraine to determine its own sovereignty and territorial integrity, while they continue to ignore the fact that Turkey occupies 1/3 of EU member Cyprus? So there's Turkey's activities that are independent of that of the U.S., end of the European Union, end of NATO, and the extent to which not only Washington will have to reconsider Turkey's position as a once strategic but increasingly unreliable ally that will likely remain in NATO for the foreseeable future, and also how the European powers, both within the context of NATO and as a separate independent European Union bloc, will seek to challenge Turkey's activities that very much undermine European cohesion, solidarity, and respect for the rule of law.
About the cooperation between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, does it still remain significant for U.S. policy in the region, the 3+1 scheme?
Well, first, I think it's very important for the countries themselves. I mean, let's take the United States out of the equation.
Okay.
It doesn't matter per se whether or not it advances U.S. policy if it's in Greece's interest and Cyprus's interest and Israel's interest to build their ties, energy ties, defense cooperation, technology ties, a whole host of issues that are so important for these three democracies that are encased in this arc of crisis in the Balkans, in Ukraine, in the Black Sea, in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, in the Red Sea, in Northern Africa. These are the three democracies whose stronger ties only elevate their respective economic strength, political influence, and overall security. So the extent to which Greece, Cyprus, and Israel are binding their countries together is a positive in its own right, for its own sake. Layer on top of that the fact that the United States looks very favorably upon this trilateral alliance of democracies and like-minded security partners in the Eastern Mediterranean makes this an even more valuable asset for the United States and for European, Middle Eastern, and overall regional security. But first and foremost is the fact that it advances Greece's interests as well as those of Cyprus and Israel. So it's a net plus from almost every perspective: regional, European, Middle Eastern, and American.
Now, in the Ukrainian front and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Europeans seem to prepare even for a direct military conflict with Russia within the next 4 or 5 years. What are the prospects there?
Unfortunately, I think the prospects for the future of Ukraine are very bleak. Right now, there is no significant additional U.S. aid in terms of military hardware that is coming to Ukraine, except for what was last authorized under the Biden administration in April of 2024. And my sense is that President Trump is loath, will not bring any new offensive weaponry into Ukraine because he is trying very, very hard to bring Presidents Putin and Zelensky to the negotiating table for a political settlement, not just a ceasefire. Europe, we understand, has both problems in terms of weapons stockpiles. They don't really have much material to send to Ukraine, and they also have an industrial production under capacity. I mean, much of Europe's defense production facilities are hollowed out because of neglect over the last several decades. And so I don't think there's going to be a realistic prospect of major new arms coming to Ukraine unless Putin engages in such reckless and offensive behavior beyond what's been committed over the last 3.5 years that President Trump feels this is hopeless and decides to open up the American arms inventory to beef up Ukraine's defenses. But that doesn't seem likely right now. Russia is going to probably keep the 4 oblasts that it's declared as Russian sovereign territory. It will certainly keep Crimea, which is a red zone, a red line, I should say, for Russia. The average age of the Ukrainian soldier is 43 years old. This is a country whose quarter population is either displaced inside of Ukraine or are refugees in various European countries. And Russia is on a 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week wartime production economy right now, and is producing far more artillery, rockets, and munitions than Europe is able to provide to Ukraine, let alone for Europe's own defense. So I don't really see how any further battle here is in Ukraine's favor. The problem is that Ukraine had an opportunity to enter into a peace agreement with Russia in March of 2022, several weeks after the invasion was launched. And unfortunately, President Zelensky took the advice of UK, United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson, probably acting at the behest of then President Biden, to continue fighting under the misguided belief that the United States and the NATO alliance would continue to provide arms to Ukraine. And now we see a country that is being gradually destroyed by the overwhelming military might of Russia day after day after day.
Is it possible that Russian ambitions go beyond Ukraine, let's say the Baltics or Moldova?
I don't see any credible threat from Russia in an overt kinetic military style against a single square centimeter of NATO territory. Vladimir Putin is not a stupid man. He does not want war with NATO, which means war with the United States. Ukraine is not a NATO ally, and so he's been able to operate there with relative military freedom, especially the territories that he currently controls. And if there's any possible move towards Moldova, again, Moldova is not in the NATO alliance, just the way Vladimir Putin was able to move into Georgia in 2008 and the first time in Ukraine in 2014. However, Putin does see the NATO alliance as a hostile enemy on the European continent and will likely continue to try to politically destabilize or undermine countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, possibly Poland, other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, whether it's through cyber attacks, whether it's through disinformation campaigns, whether it's a whole host of other asymmetrical gray zone tactics to try to keep those political systems and economies off balance. But I do not envision any overt military assault on a single square centimeter of NATO territory, because that would bring about war with the United States, which I think Vladimir Putin is absolutely dedicated to avoiding.
What about the elephant in the room, or rather the dragon in the room, China?
Well, from a U.S. perspective, the Communist Party of China is the single greatest strategic threat, not only to the security and well-being of the United States, but frankly to the international economic, political, and technological order. And the U.S. is undergoing very serious foreign policy and national security debates right now to try to see to what extent we can better position our assets to deter and dissuade China from, for instance, I don't think so much preparing for an invasion of Taiwan, but seeking to strangle Taiwan into submission and eventual annexation and absorption into the People's Republic of China, and to dissuade it from the kind of aggressive activities it's undertaking in open violation of international law and international treaties in the South China Sea against Japan, against the Philippines, against South Korea, against India. And of course, on a technological front, given the fact that the 21st century global economy will be predicated on increasingly advanced technologies, it's very important that the United States work both unilaterally and multilaterally with our European and East Asian democratic allies in the race to prevail in artificial intelligence. The country and the economic power that is dominant in artificial intelligence will set the norms and values and platforms and standards for the global interoperability of breakthrough technologies in quantum computing, in robotics, in synthetic biology and nanobiology, and aerospace, engineering, military hardware, space communications, satellite systems. And so it's very important that the United States work as closely as possible with our democratic partners in Europe and in Asia to ensure that we remain the champions of artificial intelligence, technology, and military influence and economic power, and ensure that the People's Republic of China, led unfortunately by a rigidly Leninist ideological communist party, is doomed to its own internal demise. And ultimately, no one is looking for a military conflict with China, which would be utterly catastrophic, but probably the greatest step towards global stability and peace would be an end to the communist regime in China, as we saw with the end of the communist regime in the Soviet Union in 1991. But that doesn't seem to be in the works anytime in the near future.
Sir, thank you very, very much for our conversation. Thank you very much.